Good afternoon to those of you joining us. Okay, my clock says 2:01, and we have quite a few people who've joined us already, so maybe we'll leave the poll open for another minute or so, and then we'll dive in. Just to kind of kick things off, we are on our third of 5 of our Friday seminar sessions. Thank you all for joining us. This week we have Alison van Eenennaam, and I'll give her a proper introduction before she starts. And then next week we have upcoming Robin White, and then we'll wrap things up on April 30th with Frank Mitloner and Ermias Kabrib. So with that, Alison, I will throw it to you to go over the poll questions, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Betsy. So our audience had mixed feelings on the milk alternatives for retail sale, but the correct answer there was 7.5% in 2019. And then the meat sales of sorry, I had the wrong one there. So the correct answer here was 7.5. The correct answer for meat sales, plant-based meat sale alternatives, was less than 1%. That's correct. Few of you had higher thoughts there. And then this audience is very clearly very cluey because, in fact, there hasn't been any cultured meat sales in the US at the current time. And I'll get into that a little bit during my presentation.
Fantastic. Well, before Alison gets into that, I think probably many in our audience know Dr. Alison van Eenennaam. She is a cooperative extension specialist in animal genomics and biotechnology in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. Her program focuses on the use of animal genomics and biotechnology in livestock production systems. And she's currently working on projects including the development of genomic approaches to select for cattle that are less susceptible to disease and the development of genome editing approaches for livestock. She uses a variety of media to inform general public audiences about science and technology, and I think that next opportunity is coming up that's tomorrow, coming up at Picnic Day. Alison actually joined ANR in 1991. She was a cooperative extension dairy and livestock advisor in the Sacramento area for a few years, and then tackled her PhD and worked in industry, and then returned to ANR as a cooperative extension specialist in 2002. Over the years, her work has been quite widely recognized. Just a few of her accolades include the American Society of Animal Science National Rockefeller Prentice Breeding and Genetics Award, James H. Meyer Distinguished Achievement Award, Council for Agriculture, Science, and Technology Borlaug Communication Award, American Society of Animal Science Extension Award, the APLU National Award for Excellence in Extension, and that's just a short list. So we're very pleased to have one of our own with us today to talk about animal scientists and alternative meats, learning from past science communication failures. Alison, take it away.
Well, thank you, Betsy, for that introduction. And I'm looking forward to giving this presentation to this audience. I actually have just presented this to the British Society of Animal Science, who, ironically enough, asked me to present it last year in about a month after COVID started. So obviously that got postponed, and so I presented it this year. And I think this particular topic is kind of an interesting one. And I guess one of the things I really hate about Zoom is not being able to read the room or gauge your audience reaction. And sometimes I feel working in animal agriculture, and especially biotechnology, and kind of a controversial topic, is that I often feel like a ladybird in this particular little cartoon here, where the ladybird is saying to the other her fellow party attendees, isn't it great when you land on a human and they get all happy? And these various pests that are mosquitoes and ticks and the like are all looking at her, because they clearly don't share her experience nor her worldview. And I feel like that when I talk about the fact that I work in animal agriculture with my urban colleagues, and I'm excited about the innovations we're researching, and I know the history of how basically using technology in agriculture has reduced the environmental footprint of, for example, a glass of milk to a third of what it was in the 1940s as a result of improved genetics, improved feeding, improved health. And I really do understand that we have a big role to play in the ultimate sustainability of food production. And I guess, I feel this challenge of change that we're in at the moment is really not livestock's first challenge of change, if you will. And anyone working in animal ag in 2021 is familiar with the trade-offs that result from misinformation and fear-mongering around animal source foods. And I give you, as an example, pink slime, a horrible sounding name for a process to add smaller pieces of lean meat to ground beef to produce a leaner product and reduce food waste by utilizing as much meat from an animal as possible. And you would think that would be a win-win. And the story of how this rebranding from lean, finely textured beef to pink slime reveals just how much these labels matter and how futile it is to try to counteract FUD, that is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, with FED, facts, explanations, and data. And it's also not the first time that there have been ambiguities around the consumption of animal source foods and contradictory dietary recommendations. And thinking back over my lifetime, there's been the margarine versus butter debate, which I guess turned out to be nothing more than a well-intentioned guess. And the don't eat eggs to eat eggs, they're the perfect protein discussion. And now there is the eat one kingdom and not the other debate. And it's perplexing to me as a member of an omnivorous species that the framing I now have to pick is a kingdom for dinner rather than a nice Cobb salad. And this type of dichotomous framing, either or rather than yes and, is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. The demonization of a breeding method, genetically modified organisms or GMO, has effectively blocked global farmer access to useful genetic innovations. And although I'm sure Abraham Lincoln meant well when he spoke these words, the data suggests that many do believe what they read on the internet. And it's been incredibly frustrating that no amount of FED, facts, explanations, and data has been able to counteract the narrative that GMOs are unsafe, despite the consensus opinion of every major scientific society on Earth. And so now we sit with only 37% of the general public believing it's safe to eat genetically modified foods. A full 51 points below scientists pose the same question. And this disconnect between public and scientific opinion is actually the greatest for this topic amongst the many politicized scientific topics, including vaccinations and evolution. And as we have discovered during the pandemic, narratives that are based on emotion or fear are difficult to address using reason and logic. And it doesn't hurt to have a charismatic or famous spokesperson delivering the message, irrespective of their expertise on the topic. I give you the food babe, a computer science major who is of the opinion that if you can't pronounce a chemical, it should not be in food, and was successfully able to mobilize her food babe army to convince Subway sandwiches to remove a preservative from its bread, as that same chemical also happened to be used in the manufacture of yoga mats. And so now we move into perhaps an even more controversial topic, or at least an increasingly controversial topic, and that is animal source foods. And perhaps the one thing that we can all agree on is that there is a looming demand resulting from an increased human population and rising incomes in the developing world. Collectively, the FAO predicts an increase of around about 400 million metric tons between now and 2050. That is about as much terrestrial meat as we currently produce. And it is what to do about this predicted increase as to where it gets interesting. One perspective is that this is a production challenge. And this admittedly is kind of a perspective that I'm the most familiar with, so-called the wizard perspective. That is, there is a need to change how food is produced by improving the efficiency of food production. I called it the wizard after the recent book by Charles Mann, The Wizard and the Prophet. And there's kind of a strong strand of optimism or pragmatism underlying this approach. It presents a positive vision of human ingenuity. And perhaps if I was going to critique it, Less attention is paid to the potential negatives of overconsumption of animal products in middle to high income countries like the US, and rather the importance of meat and dairy to consumers in low to middle income countries is emphasized. And I guess the reason that I'm a wizard or a wizardly thinker is just looking back at the last century, as the human population increased from 1.6 billion in about 1900 to around 6 billion in 2000, it was really ag research that fueled an avalanche of innovation that resulted in the reduction in life-threatening famine during the 20th century. This has been called one of the greatest unacknowledged triumphs of our lifetime. And I'm going to let, ironically, David Bowie summarize what role animal science, nutritionists, geneticists, veterinarians played in this from 1961 to the present. I want you to keep an eye on the fact that these improvements have not been uniformly achieved throughout the world.
Oh, yeah. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. There's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't tell them to grow up out of it. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Where's the shame you've left us up to our accident? Time may change me. You can't twist time. Strange fascination fascinating me. Our changes are taking the pace I'm going through. Changes.
Wow, chickens. The growth of the poultry industry has really been astounding. Were it not for the productivity and feed efficiency gains of the last century, how many more chickens and how much more feed would have been required to produce the product that was produced in 2018? Poultry is now the most consumed terrestrial meat globally, 132 million metric tons in 2020. They are feed efficient, but as monogastrics, they more directly compete for human edible food. Over a third of global soy is fed to chickens and other poultry, a fifth goes to pigs, and 6% for aquaculture. And if we look at projected increases in the next 10 years, we can see that terrestrial meat production is expected to expand by nearly 40 million metric tons. Overall, the bulk of this meat increase is going to be 15 million metric tons of poultry, 10 of pigs, 5 of cattle, and 2 of sheep in the developing world. The majority of this expansion is expected to occur in Argentina, Brazil, China, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Turkey. And if we put this together and look at livestock production by region, we can see that East and Southeast Asia is the leader with about 119 million tons of protein in this region. And that's mainly driven by monogastric species, that is the chickens and the pigs. Western Europe, North America, and Latin America, and Caribbean and South Asia have comparable production levels between 10 to 12 million tons of protein. However, the profiles are quite different. While beef, milk, and chicken play a main role in Latin and North America, Western Europe's production is mainly driven by dairy cattle, whilst in South Asia, a major role is also played by buffalo production. And while it might not appear there are many cattle in South Asia when looking at beef production, low beef production does not necessarily equate with low cattle numbers, especially in India, the country with the most cattle and buffaloes on Earth. It is perhaps somewhat ironic that this country, with the largest population of cattle and a large dairy nation, also has very low rates of animal source food consumption, and in fact has one of the highest rates of childhood malnutrition and stunting. Obviously, cattle are extremely important in Hindu religion. Again, livestock provide more than just hamburgers. And another thing that caught my attention when preparing this presentation was the large number of cattle in Africa, home to around 24% of the global cattle population. This graph shows the growth from 1961 to 2018. And many developing countries have high emissions intensity for beef, in part due to low production per animal, but also because ruminants, by their very biology, are responsible for a disproportionate amount of livestock greenhouse gas emissions by virtue of the methanogens in their rumen producing methane as they digest cellulose. And so if we put all these numbers together, we can see that the developing world is contributing around about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants and 56% of the emissions from monogastrics. However, the good news is there is significant potential for further efficiency gains, because while technologies and practices that reduce emissions are in existence, they haven't been widely adopted, despite the fact that many of them offer both economic and environmental benefits. Such efficiency strategies are reported to have the potential to result in a reduction of around about 30% in greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector. In this increased efficiency strategic perspective, the one I hold, the livestock sector is identified as an important stakeholder in delivering on the mitigation efforts necessary to reduce GHG emissions. I guess my point is, don't alienate the world's livestock keepers. They are potential allies. It's estimated about 81% of the additional beef that's going to be produced by 2029 is going to be produced in Argentina, Brazil, China, Pakistan, and sub-Saharan Africa. There is work to be done to ensure that this increased production comes from more efficient systems rather than increased numbers of cattle. And there is ample opportunity for this to be steered towards low emissions, especially where livestock serve social and economic purposes other than production, such as transportation. This is my kind of wizardly take on the situation, which I guess contrasts to the more profity take. And this sees it as a consumption challenge, which requires changes to the dietary drivers that determine food production and demand restraint. This perspective tends to emphasize obesity-related chronic diseases and focuses really on industrial animal production, quote, or factory farming, and pretty much ignores the fact that many animal production systems take place in extensive production systems in the developing world. And this has recently kind of morphed into this plant-based food, pick a kingdom dichotomy. This perspective is especially evident in the discussion of plant-based meat substitutes. Noticeably, whilst this perspective strongly emphasizes the diet-related chronic diseases associated with overconsumption of animal products in middle and high-income countries, it tends to overlook that they provide a vital means to improve malnutrition and stunting in low and middle-income countries. So what are we talking about when we're talking about these alternative meats? There's kind of two categories. One is plant-based meat substitutes, which are just that, but they're not your grandpa's veggie burger. Oftentimes, they include additives from cellular agriculture to provide nutrients that are high in animal products like B12 or soy leg hemoglobin synthesized by recombinant microbes. In a way, it's kind of a wizardly or technological approach to making more realistic meat substitutes, based on the belief or sometimes conviction that animal source foods are invariantly bad. Shown here are some of the high-profile plant-based products available in the United States. Here I show you Perfect Day co-founders, this is a California-based company which is creating vegan dairy proteins without cows. And the framing for this company is that finally there's a new option for dairy lovers and plant-based fans alike. We've invented the world's first real milk proteins made without animals, so you can enjoy the real taste, texture, and nutrition of dairy produced sustainably without the downsides of factory farming, lactose, hormones, or antibiotics. And shown here are two rather famous individuals, the two plant-based beef substitute companies, Beyond Beef and Impossible Burger, that are producing plant-based hamburgers. And these companies I guess somewhat improbably, were both founded by California men with the last name of Brown, with a fondness for cow t-shirts. One, Beyond Meat, is produced from peas, and you'll notice is proudly non-GMO, with a little butterfly prominent on the package. In my opinion, a bit of a gutsy or ill-fated suggestion, because they basically have eliminated cellular agriculture additives from their supply chain, and that eliminates the possibility of adding nutrients that you can produce using cellular agriculture to mimic the nutritional composition of meat. The other, Impossible, is proudly GMO and is produced using soy. In fact, the founder, Pat Brown, shown here, is a scientist who used to be a professor at Stanford and was one of the inventors of the DNA microarray and co-founded the Public Library of Science, or PLOS, in 2001. He received the National Academy of Science Award in molecular biology. And his origin story, if you will, is that in 2009, he took a sabbatical where he considered how to spend the rest of his career. And there he founded Impossible Burger. It is proudly GM, with its infamous bleeding GMO leg hemoglobin. And ironically, when this came out, the same anti-GMO groups that targeted genetic engineering in agriculture went after the Impossible Burger for using GMO heme and soy. And using the same fear-mongering around GMO in Impossible Burgers, claiming that it hurts rats in a feeding study, and this was from GMO Watch, which made a lot of hay out of the Seralini GMO rat study, and Consumer Reports and the Center for Food Safety. They were trying to denigrate and create fear around this product. And Impossible Foods fought back. Rachel Conrad, the Chief Communications Officer, wrote, "Finally, we'd like to request that Consumer Reports disclose its anti-GMO agenda in full transparency and the biases of its activist employees. For years, Consumer Reports and fellow anti-GMO ideologues have been waging a PR war against GMOs, whether in vaccines, insulin, cheese, or more recently, the Impossible Burger." Well, I gotta say, so far I am loving this additional high-tech source of plant-based protein, adopting genetic innovations to improve its nutritional profile to help address this upcoming tidal wave of protein demand. All hands or technologies on deck, as they say, and a willingness to defend the need to use innovation in food production. It would seem like an obvious ally for agricultural scientists. Here's Pat Brown describing the future of his company.
What do you see as the future of your company, like in 10 years? Where do you see Impossible Foods?
Well, our mission is to completely replace animals in the food system by 2035. So, and you laugh, but we are absolutely serious about it. And I think it's doable. And I'll just say, better technology wins in the market. And, you know, from the time the first super crappy low resolution digital camera came on the market until Kodak basically shut down its film business was about 10 years.
So just to be clear, in 14 years' time, 2035, your company plans to eliminate animals from the food system globally, because that would be, just on a simple weight basis, around 15 trillion quarter pounders annually. And I put that number on a super crappy low resolution digital camera because I really think that there's a fundamental distinction between technology required to make digital cameras, or DNA microarrays for that matter, and food. And the fact that livestock are actually serving social, religious, and economic purposes other than production in the livelihoods of more than 1 billion people. And I really feel that this attitude really ignores the importance of animals in smallholder food systems, where they not only provide nutrition, but income, asset provision, insurance, nutrient cycling, and institutions like the FAO have been working towards higher awareness of the contributions of the livestock sector to the Sustainable Development Goals, including economic growth, poverty reduction, ending malnutrition, gender equality, hello, and ecosystem service provision. Eliminating animals from smallholder food systems would have huge ramifications on over 1 billion poor people, mostly pastoralists in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, 2/3 of whom are women and who depend on livestock for their foods and livelihoods. These people have to be part of this discussion. So what's the other alternative meat? And this is one that's getting a lot of attention. It's so-called cultured or cell-based meat. And basically, cultured meat is taking cells from an animal and growing them in bioreactors. It basically seeks to replicate the growing conditions provided by biological systems, also known as animals, that to enable the proliferation of cells in a heated culture media. The discoveries required to reduce this idea to practice will require many innovations, ironically, some of which were pioneered by animal scientists, and the development of immortalized cell lines, media to sustain growth in the absence of fetal calf serum, growth factors to promote differentiation down different cell lineages. And it's interesting to me when reading about this, the adverse health effects associated with excessive consumption of animal products in the developed world kind of pivots in the cultured meat discussion to focus less on overconsumption to risks associated with foodborne illnesses, antibiotic use, and preventing future global zoonotic pandemics. So just last year, Singapore approved the sale of US California's company Just chicken meat product. And this is in Singapore. And if you go to a restaurant called the 1800 Social Club, you can get a trio of cultured chicken sample dishes for $23. This product is actually not all cultured meat. It's actually a blended product of cultured meat and plant-based protein. Just is a California-based company that was developed by the vegan mayo and liquid egg creator, Josh Tetrek, who's been dubbed the Elon Musk of condiments. And now we've actually moved out of California and gone over to Israel, where it was announced in 2019 that Future Meat Technologies is going to establish the world's first cultured meat pilot production facility producing GMO-free meat, again, pretty gutsy, cultivated directly from animal cells on a commercial scale. And this company says that its laboratory-based manufacturing model results in 99% less land and 80% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than traditionally produced meat. They plan to introduce hybrid products into the market, combining plant proteins for texture with cultured fats. And whilst existing costs are at $150 per pound of chicken and $200 per pound of beef, they aim to market a hybrid product at a cost competitive level from the pilot production facility this year. And I think that this framing around the reduction in land use and greenhouse gas emissions is really what's attracting a lot of venture capital to this area. And I put up here this very diverse set of billionaires that are investing in this technology. And it's kind of ironic to me working in animal ag for my whole career, and fairly male-dominated area. I think the only talk I've ever given to a 100% male audience was a group of venture capitalists. And I will give credit to Bill Gates here, because yes, he's investing here, but he's also putting money into trying to do genetic improvement in Africa particularly. And he's been funding things like the African Dairy Genetic Gains Project, the African Chicken Genetic Gains Project, and the CTLGH, the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health. You'll also notice a number of familiar traditional animal source protein providers here. And I'm sure that there's a business opportunity to be had, especially if you can sell plant proteins at the price of meat proteins. There's obviously some investment interest in this type of a technology. So the framing that attracts them is the greenhouse gas emissions. And so let's have a discussion around this. So this is a summary of different sources of protein addressed on a functional unit of kilogram of protein. And this functional unit, as was discussed last week in the life cycle assessment analysis, is really important because is the product providing anything other than protein? And of course, animal source foods are a highly nutritious and energy dense source of food that provide not only protein, but many other micronutrients. And so are these products nutritionally equivalent to each other? And what we see here is different products across here. For those of you, here's meat substitutes. And by there, we're talking vegetable-based products. Cultured meat is shown here. And then invariably, these three show up on the far right, and that's insect, and then pulses, for those of you that aren't familiar, are basically seeds of legumes, and spirulina is a type of algae. And if that's trying to minimize your GHG emissions is your goal, these are the three that seem to invariably come up across the right here. But what we often see, or we always see, invariably see, is the fact that the ruminants, the beef and sheep, show up high on a global warming potential GHG kind of graph relative to the monogastrics. And the monogastrics don't really differ that much from the estimates for the meat alternatives. It should be noted that these cultured meat life cycle assessments at this stage are anticipatory because it actually hasn't really been reduced to practice. As I said, there's only one product for sale at the moment. And the original estimate that was ever made around this is a kind of a famous study from 2011, which often gets cited by proponents of cultured meat. And its estimate is really, really low across all of these different metrics because it made a number of assumptions that I think are incompatible with growing animal cells. So it assumed you could use the same media as you can grow yeast in, which is not actually the case. And so I just put that out there because that's often the comparator that's used. And then often it'll be compared to the least efficient production systems. And I find it really ironic that the collective work of animal nutritionists, geneticists, and veterinarians have dramatically reduced this number in the developed world such that it's often down at this level. And it would seem that this would kind of align with the very same goals of reducing the environmental footprint of food production that's actually being espoused by the alternative meat companies. And I think it's kind of ironic that this is not a group that's working together to reduce environmental footprint of food production, rather setting it up as a kind of a dichotomous either or. And I guess that is part of my message around this communication. Is there a need to eviscerate each other, or should we actually use innovation to work together to address this burgeoning demand for animal source protein? So since we're focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's always important to keep things in perspective. And this is global emissions 2016. And what we see here is energy is 3/4 of global emissions, and ag and forest use is around about 20% or so. And here you can see livestock and manure at 5.8%, 2.87 gigatons. And you might say, well, hang on, I've heard a different number to that. And I think this is one of the big confusions. And Frank does a good job explaining the difference between direct emissions, which is what's shown here, that doesn't consider a whole life cycle assessment analysis, and those that do. And I think what we see here, for example, is transportation, the direct emissions, the tailpipe emissions, is around 16.2% of global emissions. And so what happened and was really misleading in Livestock's long shadow many years ago was suggesting that these emissions were greater than the direct emissions from transport. And actually what was being compared was the life cycle assessment of all animal source proteins to a tailpipe emissions of 8 gigatons in the transportation sector. If you look not only at direct emissions, but you use a life cycle analysis, then you get a number where it's not only the direct emissions from manure management and enteric fermentation, but it also takes into account the energy consumption and feed and land use alterations associated with global livestock production systems. And that takes you up to an 8.1 gigaton number. And that is around about 14.5% of global emissions. That's where that number comes from. And I think it's always important to look, a lot of this is enteric methane, that is belching from ruminants as a result of digesting cellulose. And it's just a fact of biology that ruminants, the majority of their emissions come from methane. And as a result of the fact they are digesting this cellulose, they're responsible for around about 3/4 of the emissions from the full livestock sector. And just for those, I don't think this audience I need to explain, ruminants are cattle, both beef and milk, small ruminants like goats and sheep, both meat and milk, and buffalo, meat and milk. And a lot of focus is given to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this is a really interesting study that looked at how many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were considered, what environmental areas of concern that are identified in the SDGs were considered by the low environmental impact diet literature. And basically these authors looked at 93 studies, and they compared whether the authors looked at these 14 discrete environmental areas of concern identified in the SDGs. And what they found is that almost invariably, articles focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And the authors suggested that whilst this is undoubtedly an important area of concern, it's not a proxy for the full range of environmental concerns associated with food production and consumption. It may not even be the most important one. Some of the environmental areas of concern identified were rarely addressed in the located literature or not addressed at all. They then asked, as it relates to sustainability, which metric are you trying to optimize? Because they don't all point in the same direction. And they warned that commentators on sustainable diets should not be quick to assume that a dietary strategy to reduce overall environmental impact can be readily defined, let alone recommended. And the limited evidence generally points to recommended diets having lower environmental impacts than typical diets, although a lot of that was because typical diets overconsume calories. I'm talking developed world here. And having lower inputs in recommended diets can largely be explained by overconsumption of food energy associated with average diets, which is also a major driver of obesity. In other words, you need to eat less to have a sustainable diet. And the other thing that I think they brought out, which I find really kind of part of the friction around advice coming from the public health community versus the agricultural sustainability community, is that life cycle assessments don't take changes in soil carbon stocks and carbon sequestration into their equations. And so these changes were rarely considered in this literature. And this leads to this disconnect between the science that's informing strategic climate action on the ground in the agricultural sector, where there's a lot of discussion around how we could actually sequester carbon in pastoral systems, and the science that's seeking to inform the public health nutrition community. On one hand, the livestock sector is seen as part of a positive strategy to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Regenerative agriculture comes to mind, whereas on the other hand, reducing the consumption of animal products is often suggested as a key strategy to reduce dietary greenhouse gas emissions. And sometimes it seems the two communities are not speaking to each other at all. This graph shows the potential attainable increase of soil organic carbon on grasslands. And I think it's really encouraging that GLEAM, the global assessment of kind of impacts of livestock, GLEAM 2, which came up with the 14.5% total emissions from livestock, is actually updating their considerations for GLEAM 3, which is under development. And they're going to have an enhanced accounting of nutrient use and carbon sequestration in livestock production systems. And so future versions of GLEAM are going to include modules on carbon sequestration, nutrient and water use, and interactions with biodiversity to more fully capture the different metrics that are associated with sustainability. One of the other big criticisms of animal ag, especially the ruminants, here they are again over on the left, and here's insects, pulses and spirulina over on the right, is land use per kilogram of protein. And this metric is kind of a perplexing one because, of course, not all land is arable, and using this metric is kind of inherently biased against pasture and rangeland-based production systems. There's no reason to conclude that food production on well-managed pasture and rangelands is less sustainable than food production on well-managed arable cropland, simply because the former achieves lower yields and therefore requires more land use per unit of production. And livestock production, especially on extensive cattle grazing, is actually really important for maintaining habitat and beneficial for biodiversity. And the complete elimination of all livestock production is really not reasonable from a perspective of biodiversity conservation. And I think perhaps the most important thing is that the importance of animals in nutrient recycling and the ability to utilize plants that humans cannot consume as food. And globally, around 86% of the feed, dry matter ingested by livestock, is inedible to humans. Things like grass and leaves. And very importantly, it's the crop residues and the byproducts of processing. And these are going to probably increase as the global population grows. And these products will be produced in larger amounts. And there will always be more of these byproducts, and livestock play and will continue to play a critical role in adding value to these residual products, a large share of which could otherwise result in an environmental burden. And I have a picture of myself here with a real live stuffed cow rumen. I think it's such an amazing bioreactor. It really is a self-propelling, self-cleaning, solar-powered, cellulose-driven bioreactor. And I think it's important to remember that there's much grassland that's unsuitable for crops throughout the world. The production of global feed requires about 2 billion hectares of grassland, about 1.3 billion hectares of which cannot be converted to cropland. This means that 57% of the land used for feed production is not suitable for food production. And removing animals from that land would basically produce no human food. And I've got to say, it was kind of ironic to me when I was reading one of these think tank reports around the alternate meat space. These authors suggested that by 2035, the disruption of the US beef and dairy industry by modern production methods, and by that they mean alternative meats, is going to, quote unquote, free up about half of US agricultural land. And what these authors discussed is that because pasture land is far from cities with no prospect for productive agricultural use and little amenity value, they decided that the best proxy for land that has no alternative productive use might be ranch land. And I'm not sure what they meant by ranch land, maybe dude ranches, but I think that's kind of what we've been saying. And I might add that a lot of this is privately held ranch land, and I've seen some commentators suggest it all should be rewilded, and that would be great if there's a financial incentive to do so, but this land actually belongs to someone, and I think it's kind of interesting that other people make decisions about what should happen to that land. And so I've discussed the prophet and the wizard, and I guess there's a third perspective that sees this as kind of a socio-economic challenge that considers there's an imbalance between production and consumption. So too much production and consumption in the developed world, too little production and consumption in the developing world. And it's a little bit like this poem. There was an old statistician named Angus McPherson who kept his head in the stove and his feet in the freezer. The strain was immense, but to him it made sense. On the average, he was a comfortable geezer. And that's really the problem, is that there is vast number of around about 800 million extremely poor people who are living on very little nutrients per day. And they have a diet heavily based in starchy plant-based foods. And there are vulnerable groups there, especially pregnant and lactating women and children, who would benefit from more, not less, animal-sourced food consumption to address the physical and cognitive health that comes from not having sufficient access to animal-sourced foods. And I think this is a really interesting graph that looks at meat consumption globally on the right y-axis. And it's perhaps not lost on me that I was raised in Australia and now live in the United States, so haven't ever really been in a country that's not a big meat eater. But what you see on the left axis is this childhood stunting rate. And it's estimated now that there's around about 150 million, 22% of all children 5 and under, who have high levels of stunting. And you can see this very high rates occurring in countries that have low meat intake. And so we have this issue where there's too much meat intake here and not enough here. And so what can we do to kind of balance that out? And I think that this particular perspective is one that I relate to, in that there is a lot of advocation for smallholders in farming in a diverse range of crops and livestock, and pushing for diverse systems that are better able to deliver the full range of micronutrients needed for good health. And they do look beyond just the nutritional role of meat and dairy, to consider the role that livestock play in the livelihoods of poor people that affect this, and the effect this has on health in low and middle income countries. But I've called this perspective the magician because there's sometimes a little bit of magical thinking. It can tend to romanticize smallholder production systems, and it often argues for organic or agroecological, or sometimes more recently regenerative approaches that actually forbid the use of certain innovations that could actually help some of the efficiencies associated with these types of production systems. And finally, we come to energy, where the picture changes a little bit. And so here we see cultured meat and meat substitutes. And this, of course, is because there's a requirement for industrial energy to power the bioreactors and clean the bioreactors. And that differs a little bit from the previous metrics in terms of the relative position of the different sources of protein. And I'm not going to dwell on this one source of one environmental metric, because I just feel the discussion needs to be more complex than this. But I do think at the current time, if you just look at the US system here, currently, as we all know, agriculture is about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, livestock is less than 4%. And actually factories and electricity are both around about a quarter. And that, I think, needs to be looked at if we're talking about changes in the developed world where we have efficient animal source proteins. The implications are quite different to eliminating animal source foods and replacing it with food grown in a factory using power, as compared to the developing world where the emissions are proportionally a lot greater of that proportion of those countries' emissions. And so I think that we know animal source food production is projected to expand, and it's mostly going to happen in developing countries. And addressing this future demand, in my opinion, is going to require the efforts of increasing the environmental efficiency of food production. But that approach on its own is not going to deliver sustainable food systems. And so I think it is important to pay equal attention to the points raised by other framings. And I really think we'll need wizards and prophets and magicians and plants and animals and cellular agriculture, farmers, and especially women to be involved in developing culturally appropriate food systems to sustainably address this projected increase. So what is the appropriate messaging then to address these alternative meats? Given the nuances and complexities of how we should frame this discussion, how have we learnt from past communication failures and fear-mongering like food babe? Will we use kindergarten level arguments to try to scare people away from the competition, as the food babe did with chemicals in your food, boogeymen? Oh, yes, we will. Here I show you an advertisement that's plant-based burgers are like dog food. Really? And here is an ad that aired on Super Bowl Sunday in Jan 2020.
Your word is methylcellulose.
Can you please define that?
Methylcellulose. It's a chemical laxative that is also used in synthetic meat.
Why?
Sorry, incorrect.
Spell propylene glycol.
What's that?
Propylene glycol. It's a chemical used in antifreeze and synthetic meats.
You might need a PhD to understand what's in synthetic meat. Fake bacon and burgers can have dozens of chemical ingredients. If you can't spell it or pronounce it, maybe you shouldn't be eating it. Go to cleanfoodfacts.com.
Bacon. BACON.
Really? Is that the best we can do with this really complex, nuanced discussion? I was embarrassed to be associated with meat production that day. And here we've also been trying to suggest that eating soy whoppers is going to give you man boobs, and there's no evidence that consuming soy will make you grow breasts. But dairy, on the other hand, probably could say, what? So here we have the alternative meats people kind of doing the same thing that Food Babe was doing. And here's another ad that was produced and is ironically featuring Pat Brown in response to that ad we just saw for the Super Bowl.
And our first word is poop.
What? Are you supposed to say that?
Poop. The stinky brown stuff that comes out of your butt. Poop is a mixture of incompletely digested food and billions of bacteria expelled from the bowels of animals. There's lots of poop in the places where pigs and cows and chickens are killed and chopped to bits to make meat. And there's poop in the ground beef we make from cows. Poop.
Poop. P-O-O-P. Poop.
Yes!
In 2015, Consumer Reports tested 300 samples of ground beef. They discovered that all of it, including grass-fed and organic ground beef, contained fecal bacteria. Just because a kid can spell poop doesn't mean you or your kids should be eating it. Go to impossiblefoods.com/health.
It's like a circular firing squad. I think we just have to have a more nuanced discussion that moves away from this nonsensical plant versus animal, synthetic versus natural, intensive versus extensive, GMO versus organic, alternative versus real, good versus evil dichotomy. It can be simultaneously true that overconsumption of animal source foods is a bad thing and too little is a bad thing too. And I think successful action on climate change through practical action in livestock agri-food systems is an urgent priority. But it can't come at the expense of other sustainability objectives, particularly those relating to ending poverty and achieving zero hunger by 2030. It is possible to improve the efficiency of the production systems of animal source foods, plant source foods, and cultured meat without denigrating any. And I think collectively, we need to tell compelling stories about how innovation is working towards our shared goal of decreasing the environmental footprint of agriculture and food production to counteract the possibility that misinformation around chemicals and scary sounding things, fear and uncertainty, and propaganda is actually going to inhibit the adoption of these safe innovations in all food producing sectors. And that's really going to have ultimately a really detrimental impact on global food security. So I will stop sharing my screen now, which will allow me to have a look at the Q&As, which I can't watch when I'm doing that. So thanks, and I'll let Betsy ask the questions, probably the easiest.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alison. Give us a lot to think about. I'm sure there are lots of questions out there. We do have one in the Q&A right now, and others, please feel free to type in your questions. As Alison has wrapped up, I'm sure there are lots out there. We'll kick off with this one from Dr. Kabrib. Given that livestock provide more than just protein, what would you recommend to use as a metric to compare to other food sources?
Thanks, Emmaus. I feel like this is a trick question because this is something you probably know what the acronym stands for better than I, but there is other acronyms that are more on a nutritionally balanced functional unit. So not just protein, but it also takes into account the micronutrients and the completeness of the protein. And it's got an acronym, and we should let Emmaus type it in because he'll probably tell me what it is. But I know that if you do that kind of accounting, a lot of the discrepancy between the different sources actually is eliminated because you might get protein from one source, but then where are you going to get your vitamin B12 or your iron or all the other micronutrients that come? And I think that there's ample evidence that just even a small influx for an egg in some of the developing countries can really make the difference between health and malnutrition in children in those countries. Sam Worth just typed it in there. It's protein digested corrected amino acid score. That's just for protein though, Sam. I think there's some other ones and that are associated with more generally the overall nutritional profile of food.
And then Ermias also added ecosystem services plus their use as a bank in LMIT.
Right, and I guess that's part of my concern here is that the dichotomous framing in the first world is looking at this as only food. So I can get my food from other sources, but of course animals provide more than just food. And they're not considering the ecosystem services and some of the other key metrics that are involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we're talking past each other because we're actually evaluating different metrics. And I guess that's my point, to look at the framing, where people are coming from, to try to understand, like, do you not get how this would affect this, and to try to incorporate that. Otherwise, you're talking at two different levels and you'll never kind of come to any kind of agreement. It's going to be as black and white as some of the other politicized discourses are in our society.
Very true. JP comments, great presentation. Thanks for that feedback. We appreciate that.
Okay.
A question from Dr. Leyenbauer. What can we learn from the failure of acceptance for RBST in dairy cows that would apply to our current situation?
Well, I mean, I think RBST, ironically, was kind of right around when I started in my extension role, and was part of the reason I have my job. So I guess I'm really happy about the fear and misunderstanding around BST. It is a little bit funny that I probably have my job because of fear and misinformation. But basically the same tactics we use there as Food Babe used against the Subway manufacturers, right? And so they were able to create enough fear and distrust that innovation has now been taken off the shelf. And so basically it's no longer available. And so I think what scares me is if you want to use, throw in Impossible Foods' face that they use GMOs, or that cultured meats are unnatural and yucky sounding, don't be shocked when that comes back to bite you. And I think that's what we need to learn, is that we were not willing, we were pretty much unable to defend RBST, and so now that technology is gone. And so the reduced environmental impact, I think Jude Capper has it at about 11% of milk production, something like that, in well-managed herds, is no longer available. So everybody has a higher environmental footprint as a result of that. So whose end game did we help there? So there was a short-term market share for those companies that advertised no BST, but when everybody's got no RBST, then there's no market advantage, but you've lost a useful innovation. Same with irradiation. So you eventually just lose access to that technology, and that's going in exactly the opposite direction to the way we need to go.
Very true. Okay, one last question just to wrap it up, as this is very pertinent currently. Many people point to the water footprint of meat production as an issue, particularly during this drought. Do we have a good comparison of WF with alternative meats and milks? I assume you mean water footprint there.
Yeah, there are some LCAs on water. Water's a tricky one because there's different types of water. There's blue water and green water, and so green water is basically rain that will fall whether or not you use it or not. On the land behind me is going to get rained on whether a cow's grazing it or not, and that's distinct from blue water, which is kind of water that comes out of my kitchen faucet here. So it's developed water that's going into systems. And that metric also has to look not only at those two, because a lot of cattle production is green water, so those animals behind me. And so if you count that in, it looks like a bigger number, but if you didn't produce that cow, that water wouldn't have done anything other than what it did, which was get rained on a field. But it really also depends on how water scarce the location is. And so there's an additional metric that has to go into water calculations, because if there's ample water, it's less of a competition problem for scarce resources than if there's a very drought type environment. And I guess California would probably be a classic example in that regard.
All right, we are at 3:01, but we'll throw in this last question here. That just popped in. Current federal legislation is seeking to end CAFOs. How might concerns be reframed, especially given most meat or most beef ends up in CAFOs in the U.S.? Can we recognize CAFO's role in resiliency, or is animal welfare concerns too hard to overcome?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a scientific answer there, which has to do with the reason that we have CAFOs is we have a really productive corn belt. And that has its benefits of, and there's this kind of tension between animal welfare friendly, extensive, low production systems have high environmental impact or greenhouse gas emissions per unit product versus intensive systems with corn finishing have, relatively speaking, low greenhouse gas emissions per product. And so what's the metric you're trying to optimize? And depending who you are, you might value that differently. But what I think is important is to point out the trade-offs. So we could get rid of CAFOs, but appreciate that that will increase the overall environmental footprint of a pound of beef, for example. And they'll be around longer because it's going to take them longer to finish, right? We know that. So I think those trade-offs are important for us to point out.
Okay, and with that, we'll wrap it up with several thank yous we're seeing in the chat. Thank you all for attending. Reminder that those of you who are part of the dairy or the livestock program team, we will be popping over to our other link to do our internal collaboration meeting, and look forward to seeing everyone back here next week as we welcome Dr. Robin White. Everyone take care, and thank you so much for attending.